Hi, good morning. I'm Lee Howard with Diana T. Myers and Associates, and thanks for joining us this morning for our 2021 CoC NOFO webinar. I am joined this morning by Helen Kelly from DMA. I think Helen's the only DMA person on this morning other than myself. And we have Brendan Aumann on from DCED. So welcome everybody and thanks for joining us. If you are worried about the PowerPoints and writing things down, just know that we'll be circulating the link with the PowerPoint along with instructions for renewal applicants after this morning's webinar. Hopefully you'll have it by the end of the day in your inbox. Folks are not muted this morning, so if you're not talking, if you could mute, that would be terrific so that there's no background noise. But if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat. If you have questions, you can also certainly pop yourself off mute and jump in. We're all just old friends here, so feel free to be casual and jump in and ask away. Helen, is there anything you want to say before we get started?
No, we're good to go.
Okay, terrific. So I'll just say right off the bat, you may have heard folks, we're going to get to a slide that says this, but you may have heard folks talk about the NOFO or the NOFA, or you may have heard both words this year. It's true, HUD changed the name. This seems to be the NOFA controversy of the year. HUD changed the name from NOFA, which is Notice of Funding Availability, to NOFO, which is Notice of Funding Opportunity. If you're like me, you've already made up plenty ditties to, say NOFO as many times as possible in weird ways. I've heard a rap already, not by me, just to be clear. I've heard 2 songs, and I've heard something similar to a haiku with NOFO. So hopefully you'll have fun with it, if nothing else. But because I am slow to move, it may take, you may hear me say NOFA many times this morning as opposed to NOFO. So yeah, if you do something really interesting with it, please feel free to share. Anything to get giggles during the NOFA period is certainly encouraged and welcomed. So with that, I think we're ready to get rolling. This is our webinar agenda for today. We're going to talk through the HUD policy priorities. We're going to talk through the funding amounts that are available in both the Eastern and Western Pennsylvania COCs and how HUD is breaking out the Tier 1, Tier 2 funding this year. We're going to talk about the scoring of the 2021 COC application. We're going to talk about the new projects, which include both the COC bonus money, reallocation money, as well as the DB bonus. We're going to talk through other new projects types like transitions and expansion projects. We're going to talk about the appeal process specifically for new projects. Just very briefly, we're going to talk about renewal projects, which also folks may opt to do consolidation. And then we're going to talk about the eSNAP submissions, resources, and some and then have some time. Our hope is for Q&A. So quickly, I'm going to walk us through. I know a lot of folks are most interested in hearing about the project level, which is why we put it at the end to keep you captive until then. But also, it's really important to hear sort of the policy changes from HUD. This is the annual application is really the opportunity for the COC to demonstrate to HUD the work that we've accomplished, the outcomes that we have accomplished, and it also sort of really signals the direction of where the COC is either moving or needs to move towards. In addition to that, we usually send out and certainly anticipate doing this again this year, surveys for folks and reach out directly to folks to say, help us understand in more detail, your relationship with child welfare, with your local jail, with, the school district and your community in regards to the homeless liaison and things like that. So just having sort of a sense of the HUD policy priorities as well as the COC application scoring is really helpful for us, for you all to have, and hopefully it's something that is of interest to you as well. I will say that I sort of think about this in sort of two different buckets. The NOFO, NOFA itself is more of a value statement, a philosophy, if you will, of really where HUD is going, where they are, where they're going. They're signaling things that are forthcoming. And then the CoC application is sort of really where they break that down into actual questions that you can respond to. Sometimes there's a one-to-one correlation. They say something in the NOFA and you see that question appear and you think to yourself, I remember reading that in the NOFA. And then other times HUD describes something that is very broad and grand and intimidating, especially if you are not already doing that. And then you get into the CoC application and it's like a yes, no checkbox. And you think, phew, I dodged a bullet this year. We can say yes, and based on what the actual question is this year. But that's an example of a way that HUD is sort of signaling that this was easy to respond to this year, but watch out. We're coming in a more comprehensive way for information for this in future years. And there are a couple of ways in which that has changed this year, and we'll get to that. So this is just a quick snapshot of the policy priorities. Ending homelessness for all persons, that's been the #1 priority for a number of years. Using a housing first approach, it says right there, it's back. You might be thinking, did it go somewhere? It did not for you. In the last application in 2019, under the last administration, the housing first language was sort of watered down to more of a low barrier language. The Eastern and Western PA CoCs did not opt to change the housing first requirements for our CoCs. So nothing changed for you, but I think it's important to know on a federal level that commitment to using housing first is back and back in a big way. There's a lot more questions. HUD wants to know how we're monitoring folks for housing first, et cetera. So it is back, although it never left. There's so many songs that are running through my head right now that we could like sing along to, but we'll keep moving. #3, reducing unsheltered homelessness. This is a new priority. Prior to COVID, we had heard that they were going to target a 10 or a dozen cities across the country that were experiencing sort of really exploding numbers in terms of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. That work sort of got, paused like a lot of other things, but HUD is really sort of keeping that unsheltered homelessness focus in this year's NOFA. #4, improving system performance. There's some changes there, but that's not a new one. We've had that's been pretty consistent over the last several years. The number of points allocated to system performance has changed from under 40 to I think it was 63 or something in 2019. #5, partnering with housing, health, and service agencies. We're going to talk a little bit about this one. This one is new. Racial equity is new, and then persons with lived experience also new. Okay, so as I mentioned already, #1, ending homelessness for all persons. This is not new. HUD is expecting us to identify, engage, and effectively serve all persons experiencing homelessness. This, relates to coordinated entry, and it relates to street outreach. It relates to coordination with mainstream providers, et cetera. HUD is expecting us to measure our performance based on local data that consider the challenges faced by all subpopulations. So even though we talk a lot about chronic, a lot about veterans, youth, and families, and HUD asks a lot of questions specifically about those subpopulations within the CoC application, they're making it clear that this is not, this sort of policy priority, this goal, ending homelessness for all persons, really does mean all people. Have a comprehensive outreach strategy. Again, right there to engage all individuals and families who are unsheltered, again, with that focus on unsheltered, and then again, using local data to determine the characteristics, the highest needs, and making sure that we are having sort of a client-driven housing and support system. Using a housing first approach, number two, you all know this, this is not new, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but a couple things I just want to point out. HUD is really emphasizing the importance of rapid placement. This is something that is not new to you all because it's one of our strategies in regards to reducing the length of time homeless, is recognizing that if you have no openings in your program as a provider, you are not likely to have resources to be able to end someone's homelessness. So they're going to continue homeless. But when you do have an open resource, and that is the client that you're reaching out to, the faster that you are able to assist them in that rapid placement to permanent housing, it does have an impact in terms of shortening their length of time homeless, which is obviously important for the household. It's also important for the CoC in terms of our outcomes. The important part that's really back, this is the part that was sort of watered down the last round, is the second half of that first bullet, and says, and does not have service participation requirements or preconditions. So the issue that or sort of the definition that was being used previously was, we need to house everybody. They then sort of removed some of the language or watered down some of the language about what circumstances you can then remove somebody from your program, which makes no sense. I don't know why we would house everybody only to then evict them from housing or terminate them from our programs. But regardless, that's yesterday, this is today, and we don't have that language sort of hanging out there. CoC programs should help households move quickly. We just talked about that. Part of what we've been talking about for a number of years at this point is engaging landlords and property owners to identify an inventory of housing. I know this is like, we're not going to get into this, but I think we could have a 7-hour webinar this morning on the challenges of finding housing units right now, given the climate. I know it's a challenge. HUD knows it's a challenge. But this is sort of still remaining out there as a policy priority. And again, I already mentioned this, HUD is encouraging CoCs to assess how well housing first approaches are being implemented in their communities. This is something that we're already evaluating as part of the annual scoring process. Based on the language from HUD, it may be something that we need to figure out how to incorporate in a very specific way in terms of the quarterly monitoring process that will be starting this fall. It won't be immediate, I can tell you that, because we will still be in the NOFO application process, but be on the lookout for sort of additional work forthcoming around that. Reduce unsheltered homelessness. HUD is looking for us to identify permanent housing for folks who were unsheltered. This is one of those that they're sort of signaling to us that there's more coming. Specifically in the NOFO, they make a point to say, this is one of our policy priorities. There are very few points associated this year with unsheltered homelessness. Part of the reason there is because the Eastern PA CoC did not do an unsheltered count, for example, last year. A number of CoCs across the country, a significant number, did not due to COVID. The Western PA CoC did an unsheltered count, but it was sort of a modified count. And so in recognition of that, they don't have a good way of sort of evaluating progress around unsheltered homelessness this year, but I do think it's something that will be forthcoming.
Yeah.
Any questions? I hear somebody. Okay. If you have a question, no problem. Feel free to unmute or type it in the chat. Helen, we have anything coming in on the chat yet? Nope. All right.
Oh, actually, I had a question that I put in the chat, but I guess I just sent it to you.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know, but if you feel it's something that to talk about, you can, or if not, you can just respond back.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. Sorry, I didn't see that. the question is, what resources is HUD giving us to engage and encourage landlords? My understanding is that they're not obligated to accept housing vouchers or ERAP. It's a great question. The answer is complicated in that the resources, I would say at this point, have been focused on training and technical assistance. The other resources I would say is that if you're not using, you should definitely, I would encourage you to find out if somebody in your community has emergency solutions grant funding, because the ESG CV money, which maybe we can have Brendan say something at the end if we have time, can certainly be used to provide landlord incentives. Some communities use their Home for Good allocation from 2020 to provide landlord incentives for that purpose. There are some other funding sources that are going to be coming out that I have yet to read. Sort of the notice, for example, for home dollars just came out earlier this week from the American Rescue Plan. I haven't read that notice yet to know if there's going to be anything that could be used for landlord incentives. Home typically can be used for tenant-based rental assistance. So they may have incorporated some landlord incentives, but it's a great question. And it is, I think that in some communities, it is just a very challenging situation. And regardless if you have all the money in the world, you're not going to be able to find a unit. At least that is certainly the word on the street that I am hearing. I think it's different in each community, but I would say right now, the one that is, I think, the most available is Emergency Solutions Grant CV money. So thanks for that question. Moving on, improving system performance. Again, this is something that we've had for a number of years as part of this. Regardless, HUD wants to make sure that we are serving folks effectively, that we're using coordinated entry to promote client choice, that we're connecting folks to mainstream resources, that it's clear how folks are allocated resources, meaning sort of that we have an open, inclusive, and transparent process for example, pulling somebody from the by name list and enrollment and prioritization. Also looking at the effectiveness of projects, determining whether or not projects that we're submitting to HUD are cost effective, and we're looking for opportunities to continuously improve performance. All things that we're already doing, so none of this is new, hopefully, to you all, and if it is, we can certainly discuss it at the end. Number 5, partnering with housing, health, and service agencies. This is new. We're going to get to this on a couple slides a little bit ahead, but here's the bottom line is HUD has been sort of looking for us to partner with housing authorities, to partner with workforce. So that part is not new. The difference is that, and this is a theme that you're going to hear me say multiple times during this morning's webinar, things that HUD has sort of conceptually looked for within the CoC application over the last several years, they're sort of putting teeth to that and being more specific. So they're saying, a few years ago, they said, are you partnering with housing authorities? Yes or no? And then they started wanting to know, for example, are you, tell us the percentage of folks who are homeless, who are accessing your public housing resources between 2 dates, as well as your Section 8. And then it's like that. Now tell us also if your housing authority has a set aside or a preference for people experiencing homelessness. And now they're sort of taking those sort of concepts and building on it. And this year's application includes bonus points for CoCs that have enough of a partnership with a housing organization that they are bringing those housing resources to the table in regards to new project applications. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. I just went backwards. Okay, moving forward. Racial equity. So again, this is not new. This has been sort of on the tips of our tongues. HUD has been incorporating discussion around racial disparities and racial equities literally within every document they've put out in the last couple of years, as well as every PowerPoint, every webinar, every training. They've done a lot of technical assistance around it, et cetera. And so that is continuing. Again, this is another example of when they've said, have you looked at your system's data to see if there are discrepancies? A yes or no box. Are you doing something to address those those discrepancies? A yes or no box. And this year they've really increased the focus on racial equity to really ensure that not only are you looking at what the issues are, that you're addressing the issues and telling them about that, but also that you are intentionally moving towards incorporating folks into the operation, the leadership, and getting input from folks throughout your CoC who look like folks who are in your service system. So that is really a theme, I would say, from the first page to the 92nd page of the NOFO this year. I think it's 92. I could be off by 1 or 2, but oh, Helen's confirming 92 is right, which is fabulous. Efforts to prevent and end homelessness must be appropriately address any racial inequities to achieve positive outcomes for all persons experiencing homelessness. Absolutely. They go on to say they use the term most generally around racial disparities, racial equity, but within the NOFO, they say the real goal here is to promote equity throughout the CoC's homeless response system for Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, non-white, LGBTQ, who are disproportionately and more likely to experience homelessness than their white, straight, and gender-conforming counterparts. This section italicized here is a direct quote from the NOFO. I'm happy to say that if you don't know, that both the Eastern and Western PA CoCs have launched diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. And if you're not part of that, and that sounds like something that you are interested in, please let me know. There was a pretty involved application process to become a member of the Eastern PA CoC's DEI committee. And we had our first meeting last week. The process at this point is being sort of directed or driven by the Technical Assistance Collaborative, who's working sort of intentionally to build up leadership within the community, the committee to sort of self-govern following their time working with us. In the West, we have Dr. Cindy Lacombe from Slippery Rock University, and she is leading efforts there to also bring a stronger diversity, equity, inclusion perspective to the CoC. And we're working sort of hand in glove with her to incorporate DEI strategies into a forthcoming strategic planning process. So good work happening there. Helen, I see you jumping into.
Yeah, so there's just a question. You just addressed it somewhat, but while we're talking about racial equity, do you mind if I bring it up?
Yeah.
Okay, there's 2 parts to this. Michelle asks, is there an example of this being this work with racial equity organizations like Urban League and NAACP? Also, is there federal training on racism or bias in housing for partners?
So I can tell you that within the outreach process in the Western PA CoC, there was outreach to Urban League and NAACP partners. I want to say that within the Eastern PA CoC, the process there was driven by the RABs to identify members representing their RABs. There's two members from each RAB. So that would have been sort of contingent upon the membership of the RAB and how much outreach perhaps happened through the RAB for that process. In terms of federal training, I have not seen it, but I do know that there is some training that was happening for federal employees around racism and bias, specifically in housing and beyond, which sort of had a historical perspective as well as how this is translated into modern day impacts. And in terms of the committee for the Eastern PA CoC, we can definitely follow up with Michelle on that. So thank you.
Is equity training from last year's CoC training, is that still available online?
I don't know.
That could be a resource. I mean, obviously not federal, but the training was very good last year.
And I do know that additional training is something that both East and West DEI committees are going to be looking towards, sort of helping to shape and guide and potentially present. I can look and work with Brendan to find out if the racial equity training is still online. The CoC's website was overhauled at some point last year, and not all of the material carried over. But if it is, we can just sort of highlight that in the email that we send to follow up. Just making a note here. Okay. Continuing on with racial equity, HUD revised its evaluation of racial equity. So I mentioned to this, basically this goes back to the idea of sort of putting teeth, asking for more specific, wanting to make sure that you're not just identifying issues, but you're identifying solutions, that you are actively working to eliminate those barriers, and looking at also the idea of incorporating, not just on the CoC level, but incorporating racial equity into the project level. So if you were in the Eastern PA CoC, you'll know for the last 2 years, we have had questions that have been relevant to evaluating racial equity. In 2020, it was not scored. 2021, it was scored, but not for a lot of points. But we're really looking at how, in your organization, are you looking at data in this way? Are you identifying resources? Are you intentionally diversifying your board? Are you evaluating your policies and procedures and your paperwork and things like that to make sure it is, intentionally inclusive? Are there any issues? Are you working with folks in your programs to identify any issues that maybe unknowing are harmful or restrictive to certain populations, etc. So if you are in the Western PA CoC, you have not been evaluated on that yet, but this is, I mentioned that HUD sort of signals like, woohoo, we're coming for more information on this. This is one of those moments where Lee is saying, woohoo, we're coming for more information on this. So just be on the lookout for that. And I'm sure by the 2022 CoC application and scoring process. The last policy priority, and then I promise we're going to get cooking here because otherwise we're going to run out of time. Persons with lived experience. This is fabulous. Every CoC sort of has the expectation that they're bringing in folks with lived experience to be part of the leadership, part of the process of operating the CoC, of setting the goals and expectations for the CoC. HUD, again, has been sort of beating that drum for a number of years. This year, they really have, it's only scored for 1 point. And so this is, again, sort of a notice of what's to come, but the language is far more in depth, far more broad about what HUD's expectations are around including folks with lived experience, which this is very much tied into equity. And beyond that, they have explained to us, why do I keep going backwards? What they are looking for around folks with lived experience. And this is really important for a number of reasons. It's important to the CoC, but it's also important because each organization that receives CoC funding is, per the interim rule with HUD, is required to have folks with lived experience who are currently or formerly homeless as part of their board. And or in an advisory capacity if necessary. I think you have to go through a waiver process for that. But my point here is to say, please listen to this if you receive CoC funding, because I don't know if HUD is going to carry this language over to the project level or not. They did not say that in the NOFA, but it certainly got my attention. When they are talking about persons with lived experience, they have articulated that means homeless within the last 7 years or are currently program participants. So that limitation of homeless within the last 7 years is really what I'm highlighting here, because that is certainly the first time that HUD has said this. The other thing is that from my conversations with folks, a lot of times what happens is that you may hire someone who is formerly homeless into your organization, which is a fabulous thing. And that they bring to your organization, both as a staff and potentially in the capacity of serving on your board, of not only having the on-the-ground experience operating your programs, but also the lived experience. And in many cases, those folks have not experienced homelessness within the last 7 years. Again, HUD may not. I just want to be clear. I don't know if HUD is going to carry this out in terms of what their expectations are on the project level. This may never come to fruition, that expectation carries over, because I would assume that they know that a lot of folks who are serving on boards and advisory capacities in this way, who are currently or formerly homeless, they are farther out than 7 years. I think that the idea and the goal here is that you've got folks who have experienced homelessness under Housing First, under using coordinated entry, and a lot of the sort of approaches and strategies that we currently use versus someone potentially who was homeless 20 years ago and had no idea who to call or what to do, and the system was far less coordinated at that point. I don't know what their motivation is, but I'm just sort of bringing this to your attention here. The other thing that came up on the CoC level is that HUD is really looking to see, do you have more than one person who's engaged in your local CoC planning, and specifically one person who came from an unsheltered situation. So again, going back to that other priority of a focus on unsheltered homelessness, this is another way that is presenting. Okay, changes from 2019. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, Lee.
No, please.
If this is the right place for it, can you comment on how in our individual agency applications we would address these priorities, if indeed there's an opportunity at all? Or is this more a scoring feature that is taken into account with the CoC's questions about our projects? Do you understand?
Such a good, I know exactly what you're saying, and it's a great question. So everything that we just talked about, for the most part at this point, is related to the CoC's scoring. What often ends up happening, though, is that when HUD starts expecting certain things of the CoC, then the CoC, we incorporate that into the new project application process, to the renewal scoring process. So that, for example, is a perfect, racial equity is an example of that, by saying HUD is looking for us to do this as a CoC. So as a CoC, we're going to create an anti-discrimination policy, and we're going to do all these things, but we're going to operationalize that policy in part through sort of the expectations we have of providers. And so the answer is that this is absolutely sort of coming, it's related to the CoC applications project as opposed, the CoC application as opposed to the project application, but it's more sort of foreshadowing, if you will, things that either as a CoC we will be prioritizing as activities that we will sort of be working with projects to implement on the project and the community level, and sort of looking more closely at how to move those priorities forward.
Lee, I will add the one priority about healthcare and housing, that is very directly linked to new projects.
It is. You're right. Thank you. Always good to have more than one person on from DMA. So thank you for mentioning that, Helen. You're absolutely right. All right, so some key changes. Obviously, the due date is changed since we're in a new year, November 16th, 2021, 8 p.m. I just want to emphasize, this is not your due date. This is the CoC's due date. We're going to get to due dates for you all. But this is the CoC's due date, November 16th, which means we will be done before Thanksgiving, which is terrific. NOFO versus NOFO, we already talked about that. Helen's going to talk more about this at the end, but if you are a person that, like me, you bombard the HUD AAQ ask a question function, their help desk, Their help desk is gone for the NOFA process. There's an email address, which we have at the end that we'll get to. There's 2 separate email addresses. There's one if you have a question related to something in the NOFO, and then there's questions if you have an eSNAPS related question. So if your question is more policy related, like when you say, are we doing housing first? Do you mean this or this? That would go to the NOFO email address. But if you're saying I'm locked out of eSNAPS, or the instructions say that I'm supposed to see this screen, but no matter what I do, that screen doesn't appear, etc., then you would email the eSNAPS related questions. I will tell you very candidly, I have not emailed the eSNAPS email address yet. I have sent, as the DMA staff has sent, a number of questions already to the NOFO email address. They are not responding quickly. No shocker there. If you're used to the AAQ, it was not fast either. But my hope is that if you have an eSNAPS related question, like I'm locked out, that they will be responsive very quickly.
I have asked to both. It was about 3 weeks ago.
Oh, you have?
Yes.
And have you heard back?
I emailed whenever that was. It was a good 2 going on. I think this Thursday will be 3 weeks. So.
And have you heard
yes.
back yet?
I have not.
Okay. We've
My
had
plan
one
is
question
to-
answered so far out of,
Okay.
I don't, probably 20. So as we get answers, if they are relevant to the project applications, we will certainly send emails out. The emails will not come through. The emails for eSNAPs and questions that are related to you all completing your renewal application or new project application will come out through just the regular email. It won't be the one that's formatted like the MailChimp. It'll just be the ones directly to the CoC renewal project applicants. So be on the lookout if we learn information related to that. Similarly, if you all ask a question because you notice something goofy that you think other people may also experience, feel free to send that information to us and we can send it out. Given the response time, I think to the degree that we can share information with each other, that's a really positive thing. So we're going to get through this. Several questions and attachments were removed from the CoC application, and there's some shifting in points. I already mentioned a return to housing first language, a shift from racial disparity to racial equity. This is not relevant in Pennsylvania because we don't have any, but tribal entities are now eligible applicants, just as an FYI. And if you have in the past consolidated different projects, there's a different process for that. It's much easier. You can consolidate now up to 10 projects instead of up to 4. And you're probably thinking, why didn't I wait? And you used to have to create like this third application, this additional application that brought all of them together. You don't have to do that anymore. So if you are a holdout for consolidation, this is your year, my friend. It would be good to seize the moment. So good news there. All right, funding and tiering of projects, tier 1. So this is very exciting. If people had asked a couple things, said, predict what's going to be in the 2021 NOFO, I would have said 3 things. 1, more focus on racial equity because HUD's been talking about it. Boom, that happened. Number 2, that HUD is going to ask us about how we responded to COVID, and they are. So that happened. The 3rd is that we are going to have a huge amount of money available for new projects. That one did not happen. Instead, the way that HUD sort of handled the fact that they did not have new project applications in 2020 because we didn't have a NOFA, they have given us a much larger tier 1 amount. If you're new to the CoC, you're probably wondering what the heck are you talking about? So I'm going to tell you, tier 1 is sort of the way that we talk about and think about the projects that, let me take a step back. HUD requires the CoC to rank every single project that we submit for funding, with the exception of the CoC's planning grant. That's money that goes to DC. D is the collaborative applicant that's used to operate the CoC. That's non-competitive money. Everything else we compete for. And we have to rank those projects 1 to number 75 or how many ever projects we're submitting that year. So the projects that are ranked in tier 1, which is basically an invisible line that's related to the budgets, are fully funded at 100% typically. And so what I mean by that is if you're in tier 1, the assumption or belief typically is that you are safe, meaning your project is not really competing for funding. So the NOFO is a competition nationally of all the CoCs in the country. And if you're in tier 1, the assumption there is that HUD has enough money to fully fund all tier 1 projects, and that you're safe. You will know what tier you're in. You will know where you are in terms of, number 1 or number 50 or number whatever in tier 1 before the application is submitted on November 16th, in case you're wondering about that. But what HUD did is they put the dollar amount equal to the annual renewal demand, which is our existing total of projects. So right now, we're going to get a screen in a minute, that all the money, all of the renewal projects that we have that are currently operating or who are available to renew for the first time this year, that is our safe amount in tier 1. Tier 2 is the money that we compete for. So folks often hear me say, the higher the score, the more money that we receive. And it's because of the way HUD scores tier 2 projects. Our score on the CoC application, which is where the competition really is, directly impacts how much money and how many projects we receive funding for in tier 2. So tier 2 is the equal amount of the CoC bonus, and that is 5% of our annual renewal demand. So again, the next screen, I'm going to tell you more specifically what that is. And then in addition to our 5% of ARD, we have a domestic violence bonus opportunity. HUD did not award, so in 2018 and 2019, each year there was $50 million available for domestic violence dedicated projects. Because there was no NOFO last year, that money carried over, and we have a total of one of the years, either FY20 or FY21, I don't remember, it was a $52 million allocation, and the other year it was a 50. So in total, we have $102 million nationally that's available for DV bonus. It's 15%, excuse me, of our preliminary pro rata need is what we can apply for. Tier 2, I mentioned this correlates directly to our score as a CoC. So up to 50 points are a direct allocation. So back when the allocation, the score was 200 points, if you received 90% of those points, meaning whatever that would be, you would receive 90 points of 50, so 45 points on that. Project ranking up to 40 points. What that means is where you are in tier 2. This is important in case you have a project in tier 2, so you understand like what is the likelihood that it's going to get funded. I would not encourage you to get into the machinations of that. Just cross your fingers and hope. But no, I'm just joking. But we can talk more about that if you have specific questions at the end. But this is how the tier 2 is scored. 50 points for the CoC score, 40 points based on your ranking. What that means, if you are in the top of tier 2, you are more safe than if you're in the bottom of tier 2. If you're in the middle, you're somewhere in between the safest and the least safe. In a nutshell, that's what it means. And then a commitment to housing first up to 10 points. Everyone will get those because we won't let you submit your application unless you have responded that you are committed to housing first. Tier 2 projects. So even though, this is really important for folks to understand, even though tier 1 dollar amount is all the total of all of our renewal projects, it doesn't mean that all renewal projects go into tier 1. It's a number. It's a number that is tied to what our ARD, our annual renewal demand is. But it doesn't, HUD is not saying that means all renewals go into tier 1. What it means is that new projects can go into tier 1, renewal projects can go into tier 1, DV bonus projects can go into tier 1, however you all decide to do it. So tier 2 projects may be renewals, they may be new projects that are created through reallocated funds, they may be new CoC bonus projects or new DV bonus projects. So we have 2 slides here. If you're from the West, don't worry, yours is coming up next, but here's for the East. The CoC currently this year, without the planning grant, we're at just over 14 million. It's this this amount. Let's see if I can make my mouse circle it. Right here, this 14 million. This is where we are right now. If you add up all of our renewal projects, 14,084. So the fact that we can apply for almost $7 million, that's a huge increase, very exciting. As I said here, our tier 1 is equal to our annual renewal demands. You can see here, this is our tier 1 amount. For bonus, that's 5% of this amount, which is $784. And then for our DV bonus, I mentioned it's 15% of this number. So that comes out to $2,352,410. So we have, that is where we really have the biggest opportunity to increase the COC's overall funding. And we're going to talk more about the DV bonus in a little bit. And then finally, the COC planning grant, as I mentioned, this is not ranked. This is a non-competitive project that does not pull out of any sort of safe money in tier 1, and it doesn't compete in tier 2. If you're in the Western COC, the total that we can apply for there is 13.7 million. Right now, we're just over 11 million, as you can see right here. That's our tier 1. Our 5% bonus, 569, and then our DV bonus, $1.7 million. The planning grant amount there is 341. So in both the Eastern and Western COC, tremendous opportunity to increase funding if we do well in the COC performance. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to blow through this scoring of the COC application, because again, this is related to the COC application, not to the project application. But I want you guys to know, for all the reasons I already said, and also because we are going to be reaching out to you all to send out some surveys and get some general information, and then we may follow up with phone calls with some of you as well. So a couple things to know. The last several years, as you can see here, 16, 17, 18, and 19, the total number of points was 200 points for the COC application. This year, 163 points is the total, with a 10-point bonus opportunity. Things that have sort of stayed really consistent: project ranking, review, and capacity. There's a lot of requirements. This takes probably half of the total NOFA time. And we're scored for 30 points of this. This is the process by which we have to make sure that we are being fair and transparent, that we're making funding decisions with groups of folks who are non-conflicted, who are looking at what are the resources and tools needed to increase the COC's performance. It's whether or not we made the information available to everyone, whether or not we had a fair and transparent scoring process, whether or not we disseminated new project RFPs, whether or not we posted things on our COC website, etc. Anything around reallocation is clearly and transparently communicated, etc. So we have typically received all 29 or 30 points in this category and fully expect to be able to do so. The big one I want to highlight here, there's a couple. One is system performance. As you can see here, in 2019, and I'm looking at this number right here, the total for system performance is 60. This year, 23. HUD makes a point to say in the NOFA, this is not meant to suggest in any way, shape, or form a shift away from system performance. This is a recognition that over the last year, COCs and providers have had quite a lot on their plate, and performance has dipped across the country. When we're evaluating people on whether or not they increase their income and there is unprecedented unemployment, you're going to see decreases in that. If we cannot find folks units, as we already talked about, you're going to see increases in length of time homeless. When we have situations where evictions are sort of on hold, as we are, you may see an increase in exits to permanent housing because nobody is leaving, or you won't see a change in that way. But my point is to say that this is sort of a 1 year reduction in points. HUD goes out of their way in the NOFA to say this is a 1 year hold or pause or reduction, but just so you know, it's going to be a priority moving forward and continuing there. The other change here that I just want to highlight is this performance and strategic planning. As you can see, it was 60 points, then 48, 40, and it's not there at all this year. This is these are the questions that were related back to the Opening Doors Federal Strategic Plan that was issued by USACH, the U.S. Interagency Council. So they evaluated things like, how many people did you have experiencing homelessness? How many chronic, how many veterans, youth, families, etc. Those questions I do believe will be returning next year. They could not be asked this year because the data points that HUD uses to evaluate those are the PIC count. And again, we talked about already that there was no unsheltered PIC count or a modified sheltered count in the majority of COCs across the country. And even beyond that, the sheltered PIC count, you know, I don't know how accurate or reliable it is, considering that in some shelters they reduced capacity, and some shelters or communities they had an overall net increase in shelter capacity because of hotels and other things. And so even within the sheltered PIC count, I'm not sure how reliable or consistent that data would be in terms of how reflective it is of our system. The last thing I'll just mention here is the CoC coordination engagement, a huge increase in points there. A lot of this is because they moved questions that weren't specific to one of these other categories into this. It's now become sort of the catch-all. Everything that didn't fit well somewhere else is now part of coordination and engagement, but there are some new questions there. And then I already mentioned the healthcare bonus, which we're going to get into. Helen, did you have a
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Can you go back on that screen?
Yep.
Thanks. I think one of the jumps, why, because there's like 20 points now for COVID related questions. So that compensates for a lot of the jump. But this is something that I wish I grasped when I was a grantee. So I just thought I would share in case it helps anyone kind of connect the dots between their projects, what they're operating in the CoC. And this is it. If you look back at 2019, second number down, 60 points for system performance. That's worth more than any other category in 2019. And that is specifically fed by all of the individual projects and how they're doing on the system performance measure and that sort of thing. So that's why what everyone does matters to the big picture. It matters for the people that we're serving, but it also matters to the CoC and how many points they can get right there. And that is huge because as Lee talked about, the more points we get here, then the more competitive we are, and then we could snap up more money than other CoCs. And I think that that point really was so far above my head when I was just trying to get people housed and just trying to get reports in. I just wanted to take a minute to try and point that out.
That's great. Thank you, Helen. Absolutely right. This is the system performance outcomes are really a representation of we are the sum of our parts. The performance that you all have is 100% drives the CoC level performance. So thank you for making that point. We've already sort of talked about this, so for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward. And some of this, again, if you're more interested, please feel free to look at this closely when we send out the slides. And if you have questions, you can certainly follow up. But things that HUD is looking for us to do within this CoC coordination and engagement sort of bucket of points, 96, is to demonstrate that we're coordinating with other systems. This includes things like discharge planning. This includes things like ensuring that folks' health needs are being met, that we are ensuring that families with children understand what their educational rights are as homeless families, and various things like that we're working with mainstream systems to sort of wrap as many supports around households as possible. That we have an inclusive and outcome-oriented community process. There's a clear way to join the CoC, that we are soliciting invitations, that we're bringing diverse representation into CoC committees, governance, etc. That we've got folks from both the private and public sector. That's certainly one of those areas that we have to really figure out how to work, I think, more strongly on is the private sector. We have very strong buy-in and representation from the public sector, really across both the Eastern and Western PA CoCs, but the private is, I think, a lot harder and something we have to move towards. that we've created a community-wide inventory for housing. This is something that it remains an eternal goal. Having an inventory is easy compared to having an accessible inventory that yields resources. And so, continuing to sort of focus on the allocation or the access to housing resources throughout the community beyond just those that are afforded through the CoC funding remains an important step and goal here. This is the breakdown, if you will, of the points to total 96. Couple things just to point out. I mentioned, if crystal ball, what is the CoC 21 NOFO going to look like this year? Addressing COVID, 20 points. This is the largest, most significantly weighed question in the entire application this year. No surprise, since that's what folks have been doing for the last 18 plus months at this point. But nonetheless, it's a huge number of points, and I'm sure that we'll be reaching out to you all for input on that. Another thing just to point out is that the points related to housing authorities has increased. Housing First, this was already a 10-point question. Rapid rehousing, this already was a 10-point question. Promoting racial equity, this is now 7 points. This is more than we previously had. There's other sort of ups and downs throughout, but this is sort of just a quick snapshot of those 96 points. This one I want to just slow down just for a brief moment on, because this one directly relates to all of you. The project capacity review and ranking, up to 30 points we talked about. We usually get all 30 of these points. But things that we have to demonstrate to HUD, I already covered this, but I just want to look at the HUD language. The existence, of a coordinated, inclusive, and outcome-oriented community process for the solicitation, objective review, ranking, and selection of project applications, and a process by which renewal projects are reviewed for performance and compliance. So the annual scoring process that we conduct each year, this is really what we're trying to accomplish. And we've been doing a good job at it, but if you ever sit there and wonder, why do we have to do this every year? This is why. HUD wants to make sure that every single project, and we have to attest to this within the submission of the application, every single project that we are submitting is moving the CoC's outcomes forward, that we need these projects to continue to reduce and end homelessness in our communities, et cetera. So things that HUD looks for, objective criteria, that includes things like, for example, cost effectiveness. It includes things like, I'm completely blanking right now on something that we spend like 500 hours a year doing. Thank you to early morning webinars, but it includes, help me out, Helen, what else does it include that's objective? I could throw like pretend candy to anybody who answers this right. We'll keep moving on and it'll come to me. Using system performance measures.
Housing First was in there.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Housing First is in there, I believe,
Yep.
is something.
You don't actually have to look it up, it's okay. We'll keep moving on. Using system performance measures, this is something that we certainly look at. The length of time homeless between enrollment into your program and placement into a program, we look at that. We look at, did you increase income, things like that. I mentioned to you that in the past, HUD has sort of had, did you do these things, yes or no? And in the 2021, they're putting more details in place to really see, like, to what extent did you do this? This is a perfect example of this. What HUD has said this year is that objective criteria needs to account for at least a third of our total scoring. It does, just so you know, but it needs to be at least a third. They also include things like, did you submit your APR on time? Did you fully draw down? Were your units fully utilized? There's other examples of objective criteria that I couldn't recall just a moment ago. They are also looking, in terms of using system performance measures, they're also looking at, did you use at least 20% of all of your points, were they allocated related to system performance? These are major shifts. HUD has never said before, we could have had one single question and said yes. And this year it's like, do we have a third of our points objective, at least 20% of our point system performance measures? We're fine for both of those, just so you know, but this is far more detailed and specific than what HUD has asked in the past. Do we use a comparable database to evaluate DV providers? Yes, based on the data that they submit, DV providers submit, it is clear to HUD that they have to pull that data from a comparable database. Do we evaluate rapid return to permanent housing and severity of barriers experienced by experienced by participants? Yes, we do that. This goes back to, did we look, there's a question, if there's one question that gets more, one scoring criteria that we get more questions about every single year than any other is the severity of needs or the vulnerability. And this is something that HUD requires and expects us to evaluate. Not only is there a yes or no box, we also have to write very detailed description of how we evaluate that across projects. Promoting racial equity in the local CoC process. And this is it's not just about questions either. This is about, did we get input from folks who are reflective of the population being served within our CoC on the criteria that we're using, on the selection process, and then actually participating in the selection of projects. And so we definitely have work to do there. This work is already done through our funding committee, but I think that there is certainly, based on this sort of additional detail from HUD in terms of what they're looking for, to really operationalize a racial equity approach. This is something that both the East and West funding committees are going to have to look to do over the next 12 months. Did we reallocate projects? Again, the only way that you can actually, it says 15 times in the NOFO, the only way that you can get any new money from HUD, the CoC bonus opportunity, is if you can demonstrate that you have a competitive process and that you are no longer going to award funding to projects that are not pushing the goals of your CoC forward, that are not increasing the system performance of your projects. And so projects that are, not spending their money, not leasing up their units, not exiting people to homelessness, the not's not supposed to be there. Projects that are exiting people to homelessness, or whose folks who are exited return to homelessness. Those are projects that are not moving the performance of the CoC forward. We don't mean like if you lost points for not going to a CoC meeting. That can certainly impact your ranking and your total score on a project level. But what we're talking about when we look at reallocation are those projects that are not utilizing their funding to reduce and end homelessness in their communities. They're not getting outcomes and related to exits to permanent housing and returns to homelessness that we're looking for. And then finally, just an overall sort of summary to HUD about our ranking and selection process. There's a lot of documents. The majority of the attachments that are submitted to HUD as part of the CoC application process are related to this section here, the project capacity review and ranking. Not only do we have to submit all of our scoring, we have to submit like a sample showing how the scoring was used. We have to provide them our ranking. We have to provide them with emails to show that all the information was sent out to you all. We have to provide them with screenshots of the CoC website that include the time and date so that they can see, did we post things within 30 days, within 15 days, within etc. They have internal deadlines within the NOFO. So if you think there's a lot of focus on this, this is why. These are 30 points that we are in control of, meaning regardless of what happens with employment and whether or not your folks obtained employment and increased income, those are things that the CoC cannot necessarily control this year. But what we can control is to ensure that we follow the HUD procedures to receive all 30 points. Project capacity review and ranking. We're just going to skip through these because I talked already in detail about those. If you're curious, you'll have them in the PowerPoint. HMIS, there's 11 points related to HMIS. One is looking at the housing inventory. The next is looking at some specific questions related to a comparable database for DV. Our bed coverage, this is a huge one that you've probably heard me talk about many times, but in both the eastern and western part of the state, we have somewhere around half of our emergency shelter beds are on HMIS. This is one of those things that we're scored on and that sort of hits us each year because HUD is looking for an 85% or higher HMIS participation rate. So this is something that continues to be sort of a challenge and a long-term goal for the CoC, but something that we need to certainly look to address over time. And then if you remember the AHAR report, the annual homeless assessment report that used to go to Congress, that has been replaced by the LSA, the longitudinal system analysis, and we get 2 points for submitting that report on time, which we did. The PIC count down to 3 points. It's basically looking at will we commit to doing a January 2022 PIC count? Yes or no? This is one of those things that we've submitted questions about already. If we say yes, and then, hopefully, God forbid this doesn't happen, but we have a huge wave of COVID explosion, in December and early January, and it's determined not to be safe that we can actually do that. What happens then if we said yes, but then it turns out to be not a safe decision? So we're waiting for guidance from HUD around that, along with effectively counting youth, whether or not what they're looking for here is a youth dedicated count, or is it incorporating youth into our PIC count planning and conduction process. So more details to come on that as we hear back from HUD. System performance, we already talked about this, going from 60 to 23 this year. This is how HUD has broken out those points. If this is the one that I think is, as you can see, are 6 points the highest. This is one that we have incorporated, really all of these we've incorporated into the CoC, the project level scoring, including the length of time homeless. And that is when we are looking at enrollment to permanent housing move-in date. As you can see here, as Helen said, how this sort of how you all do as projects translates into how the CoC scores. So when we're looking at that on your project scoring, it's in part because HUD is looking at this very closely. It's 6 points, which is the most. Last year, I think it was like 15 points. So it's a substantial part of our scoring. Okay, almost done with the CoC application. The last 2 slides here, I think. Leveraging housing resources up to 5 points. There's a couple more slides on this, but the CoC, on the CoC application, it's 163 points plus 10 bonus points. 5 of those bonus points are allocated to whether or not the CoC applies for a new rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing project that brings housing resources to the project. So what does that mean? You're applying for a 10-unit project and you have gotten a commitment from your housing authority. I'm using housing authorities. It does not have to be a housing authority. It could be a low-income housing tax credit project. It could be a HUD 202 project. It could be literally anywhere in your community that has either rental assistance or subsidized housing units. But if you bring at least 25% of those units, so let's say 5 out of your 10 in your application, you're getting rental assistance through the housing authority. They're giving you 5 vouchers to support that project of 10 rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing projects. You would receive, the CoC would receive, if we were submitting for that application, 5 bonus points, because you would be bringing 25% or more of the housing dollars to the table. So that's, the threshold's only 25. I think, we have a 25% match anyway. So I think if you look at it like that, it's like, how can we be really thoughtful and mindful about how we bring match to projects and whether or not we can partner with housing providers to do this. I will just tell you that I have a ton of questions that we've already submitted related to how we demonstrate this in the project application. So if you are coming in for this, please know that if you are selected by the funding committee for funding, we may have to work with you on the back end to make some adjustments to the project to make sure that it's going to result in the CoC receiving those bonus points. Hopefully, if you are coming in for that, we will be able to tell you that in advance. What I mean is so that there's no like, oh, instead of a MOU, we need a commitment on a letterhead or whatever it is. But there may be some tweaks as we learn more from HUD about the specifics. Similarly to the 5 points for housing, if you bring, HUD is sort of categorizing this as healthcare resources. the CoC and can receive another 5 bonus points if a permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing project uses healthcare resources to support the project. So here's a way to think about this. In some communities, this already happens. If you have a commitment, let's say, from your county mental health office that folks in your project are will be connected to intensive case managers as needed, or substance use support, or whatever that is. If you can demonstrate that in a way that meets sort of the requirements in the CoC application, or excuse me, the project application, we will be able to, we as a CoC will be able to receive those 5 bonus points. Examples that HUD sort of talks through in the NOFO are, for example, if you have a commitment, if you have a project that's targeting people with substance use, and you have a recovery center that is providing intensive substance use, inpatient, whatever it is, for folks in your program, that can count towards those 5 points. That 25% is, again, the threshold that they're looking for. So 25% of the total service costs coming from an outside, whether it's a public or private health insurance, or some other type of public or private organization. You may be sitting there thinking, what did Lee just say? This is really confusing. The housing one is black and white, totally clear. I got it. This one is, I think, a little bit more challenging. I'm not yet clear how this is demonstrated in a project application to HUD. And so more information will be provided through the new project process as we hear back from HUD, hopefully quickly. Okay, we've got 45 minutes to go and a lot more slides. So I'm going to talk very fast through the new projects. Here's what I need you to know. All of these project types are eligible through the NOFO. It does not mean that once you see the new project application come out from your CoC, that it's going to have all of these listed. I do believe in both the East and West, permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, probably the joint THRRH will be listed. We're working with DCED right now to determine whether or not additional dollars are needed to support HMIS activities. In terms of coordinated entry funding, I know the Eastern PA CoC will not be applying for additional coordinated entry funding. The Western, we're still waiting to figure that out. And then expansion grants and transition grants, those are both options that will be available, regardless of what CoC you're in. Those little asterisks there, project types eligible for the CoC bonus, that's the rapid and the joint component, as well as coordinated entry. Those will have their own RFP that will be coming out, so we'll get to that in just a moment. For the sake of time, I'm not going to focus on this, but hopefully, if you are thinking about applying for a new project, you know the definition of permanent supportive housing. If you have questions about that, this year we did an NOI, a notice of intent process, and folks who submitted NOIs hopefully got feedback. If you did not get feedback, it doesn't mean we didn't get it. It means that we didn't have any concerns or feedback or things to share with you about your project. But if you did not respond to the NOI, you can still come in for a new project through the RFP. The NOI was really just so that we could make sure there were folks that were going to be interested in new projects, because I know that money is sort of flooding the streets right now. And secondly, so that if folks did indicate that they were interested, if we could recognize sooner rather than later, then they may need some technical assistance. We've already reached out to talk to them about that. So if you didn't get a call, if we haven't had a conversation, that means that you may have gotten a communication saying, like, just be aware of this little thing in your application. That's not a problem. If you had anything that would have prevented your application from being eligible or competitive, we've already had a phone call with you. So here's the definition of permanent supportive housing. In both the Eastern and Western CoC, permanent supportive housing beds are required to be chronic dedicated. This just sort of walks through that information here, as well as the information related to passing the project quality threshold. So when you apply for a new project, what happens is your application, first you have a preliminary application. That goes to the funding committee. The funding committee reviews all of the preliminary applications received, and selects who is going to be awarded. If you come in and you apply for $400,000, and as you saw, the bonus opportunity is not significant this year, you may get a response from the funding committee said, we want you to apply, but we don't have $400,000. If you can cut your project back to 250, you're in. And so just know that those sorts of requests may come from, that doesn't mean you should tailor out the door, reduce your ask. I would recommend that everybody ask for what they believe that they need in their community to move these goals forward. But just know that the process will be, you will hear back from the funding committee about whether or not your project was accepted or rejected. If it is accepted, it may be accepted as it was proposed, or you may have some specific changes requested. So just be aware of that. If there are questions that result from that, you can certainly follow up with us. So after that happens, you go into eSnaps, which is HUD's online application system. You fill out the new project application and submit that to DMA. When that happens, Helen, the wonderful Helen, who's on the line today, will review your application to make sure, among other things, that it is consistent with what we were looking for, from what you said you were going to do, what the funding committee said. We want you to change your application in this way or that way. For example, if you say we're only going to serve families, the funding committee might come back and say, we liked your project, but we need you to serve families and singles. So Helen's going to know that, so she can be on the lookout to make sure that the application includes families and singles, just for example. She's also going to make sure that it passes HUD's project quality threshold, which means that at least 3 out of these 4 bullets are met in terms of the quality of your project application. Every single cover to cover, every single new project will be read in its entirety to make sure that it will be funded by HUD if it's selected. So we want to make sure every project, obviously, if we're submitting a project, we want to make sure that we are awarded those dollars. So if you're a first timer, just take comfort in knowing that we've got your back with that. Rapid rehousing, again, hopefully you already know the definition of rapid rehousing, but here is, this information will be on the slides, along with eligibility, with folks either being in category 1 or 4 of homelessness. Again, the review for the project quality threshold, 3 out of 4 points to pass. Here is that information. Again, it'll be on the slides that you receive. Joint transitional housing, rapid rehousing component. I want to slow down for just a moment about this, because we always have folks who are interested in this component type, that we get sort of 1 or 2 organizations that are interested each year. It is a very interesting component type. I will just mention that some things to know is that when folks are being enrolled into a joint component, they have to have the opportunity to go into transitional or rapid. It's really sort of client driven in that way. Even if they go into a transitional sort of unit, the opportunity for them to move into a rapid is supposed to be sort of continuously made and available to them. There are sort of limited, if you will, situations in which we which HUD, bless you, and others have said that the joint component is a good sort of intervention. Things that we look for example, are there a lot of folks who are living unsheltered and you don't have emergency shelter capacity in your community to bring these folks in off the street? If communities lack any sort of like crisis or safe housing for folks fleeing domestic violence, that's another example. And then youth that have, and communities with youth with high rates of unsheltered homelessness, that's similar to the first bullet there. But what I will say to that is, even if in communities that may have some shelter capacity, but if they have high rates of unsheltered homelessness among youth, the shelters that are in the community may or may not be appropriate or safe or good settings for youth. And so that's sort of recognized as a good intervention there. I will say that the appropriateness of this THRRH is not limited to only these 3 bullets, but I point this out to say that it is not going to be a great intervention or an approved intervention by the funding committee just for any circumstance. It needs to be, if you're going to apply for this, you need to be able to make a case and explain to the funding committee why you need to have the transitional housing component as part of your project, as opposed to just rapid rehousing. So something to be in mind if this is a component type that you're considering. Here's the information about the eligibility and things to be on the lookout for. Things that HUD sort of has learned from the very first year that they funded this is that you need to have about twice the number of rapid rehousing units as you do transitional. So if you're thinking you're going to have 5 transitional units, that means you probably need about 10 rapid units to go along with it. So the idea is if you're going to make rapid rehousing sort of continuously available to folks who are in the transitional housing side or coming into the project, you're going to need more of those resources than transitional. Other details are provided there. So just to let folks know, this is just a very quick snapshot. Reallocation dollars can be used to fund any project type, whether it's permanent supportive housing, rapid, the joint, the coordinated entry, or the HMIS, as can bonus dollars, any of those. You can also apply using sort of a hybrid of reallocation and bonus. Here's what I need you to know. You don't have to worry about any of this, but what you will be told if you apply for any project and you are funded, you will be told in your award letter or in some other communication from DMA or from the funding committee whether or not your project is being funded through the reallocation pot of money, the bonus pot of money, or both. I also want to clarify, in case you are applying and you're going to receive one of those 3 sort of markers where how your project is being funded. Your project is not any more competitive or less competitive based on where the dollars are coming from. The competitiveness of your project will be where it's ranked in tier 1 or tier 2, and whether it's at the top of tier 2 or at the bottom of tier 2 or somewhere in the middle. That's what will sort of dictate the competitiveness of the project, not the funding source, but it's something just to be aware of because there's a question in the eSNAPS application that asks what pot of money funded your project. And then it shows there the DV bonus, which we're going to get to in just a moment. Match, hopefully everybody knows there's a 25% match requirement except for leasing. You'll have to document your match there are some questions in the preliminary application that you submit to the CoC for the competition, and then there are more formal information that you'll have to submit in the eSNAPS application. So I want to just pause here for just a moment, and I know we're going fast, so I apologize for that. This is sort of quickly summarizing and providing a little bit more detail, and I know the font is small, so hopefully you all can see it. But when we send out the slides, it'll be 1 slide per page so that you can definitely see everything. But this provides a little bit more detail. I already talked through all of the detail on this slide, but it puts in writing some of the information related to leveraging housing or healthcare. Here's what I want you to know. If you are going to apply for a new project and you want to pursue this opportunity to bring in the housing or the healthcare costs and you have questions, please contact EMA with questions. We definitely want to get these 10 points. This is not finalized through the funding committees yet, but I can almost guarantee that within the scoring that the funding committee conducts, there will be more points awarded to projects that can bring these resources, because as I've said multiple times, the more points the CoC receives, the more dollars we receive. And so we want to incentivize you to bring these resources so that the CoC can be awarded these extra 10 points. But if there are questions that come up, you can always go to the NOFO and read the information yourself to see if there's any clarity that you find if you read it in context. There's also a NOFO page on the HUD Exchange that has AAQs. Hopefully they will continue to provide additional details about these projects. Like I said, I have a lot of projects, they have a lot of questions they haven't been answered yet, but as we learn more, we will share that with you all. Helen, did you have a question?
Well, more of a comment before we go too far down past where you showed it. A few slides ago, for each project type, there were thresholds. And I just want to make a quick comment on those. So it's a threshold because HUD says like, we will not fund this new project unless you do these 3 or 4 things. So these are non-negotiables, and it may not need to be said, but just in case, I want to put it out there. If you're going through what these thresholds are, they also start on page 45 of the NOFO, in case you want to look, but it's pretty much word for word what's there. And you're like, yeah, we got that, we got that, we got that. But it's not actually written in your application, then I don't know that you have it, and then HUD won't know that you have it, and then you won't meet threshold. So we have never submitted something to HUD that doesn't meet threshold, but there are plenty of times where applications come to our review process and we say, add this, add this. We know they will do a certain thing and it's kind of alluded to, but if it's not spelled, I don't want to leave it up to HUD to guess if you're going to do something or not. So really the best way to ensure that you meet the threshold, and you could do 4 out of 4, that's not a problem, but at least the 3 you're committing to, go ahead and spell it out as you're writing it. Say like, we will do X, Y, or Z by, and then, just lift the language, put it right in your application. And then it's crystal clear for me as the reviewer, but more importantly, for HUD. And that'll just help things go a lot more smoothly if you spell out the thresholds.
Absolutely. Thanks, Helen, for mentioning that.
Thanks, Lee.
Okay, so we're almost through the new projects, the general information. The new project RFP, I expect it to be released no later than Monday. Hopefully, if it's not Monday, it should definitely be Tuesday. I'm hoping for Friday. And if you're not dizzy yet, just go to the slide. Monday is the day we're hoping to see it out there. If it does, assuming it follows this timeline, if for some reason it's not approved as fast as we expect it to be by the funding committee, and I apologize, my hope was that I could tell you it was being released today, but we're also in the process of doing the Home for Good applications as well. And so, for example, the Western PA CoC's funding committee meeting on Tuesday was fully dedicated to that. And so it did not get the RFP approved. So all that being said, following this timeline, the preliminary applications will be due on the 6th of October. The funding committee will meet on October 12th. I just want to let you know, between the 6th, when we get your application, and the 12th, DMA will be looking at those applications and following up if we have a question. So if we think that there is something in your application that is going to prevent it from being scored, like we don't have this question wasn't answered right, we don't know how to score this part of it, you may hear back from us for some details or some clarification, or we may be asking you to, if you didn't do your budget right, for example, we may be going back to you to say, oh, this budget was not done according to how HUD figures rental assistance or something like that. So just be aware that between the 6th and the 12th, you may hear from us if we have any questions about your new project preliminary application. We expect after the funding committee meets on the 12th, we expect to have those funding decisions finalized by the end of the week with the announcements made on Friday. It could get pushed to that following Monday or something. If it does, we will let you know, but Friday the 15th is the date we expect. And regardless if you were selected or not, you will get a letter in response to your application letting you know if it was accepted or rejected, and the next steps. If it was accepted, by what date it needs to be in eSnaps, and the rest of sort of the string of deadlines associated with that. The DB bonus, and then I'm going to turn it over to Helen. As I already mentioned, $102 million nationally, 3.2 in the East, 1.7 in the West. The CoC, as I already said, Rapid, the joint, and then the coordinated entry are the project types. I don't know for certain if all 3 of these project types will be available in the East and West to apply for. I'm sure rapid rehousing will be, and I don't yet know about the joint TH and RRH. We're still working through those details. The DB bonus application will not be out yet on Monday. It will be trailing behind by a day or 2. So if you're considering applying for that, please just know that it will not be out Monday, but it will be out soon. DB bonus projects, they can stand alone. They can expand an existing project. The difference with those check marks about bonus, reallocation, or a combination, that's different for DV bonus. It can only be, if it's a DV bonus project, you're only using DV bonus project funding to apply. And then if you, what this is just clarifying is renewal projects, that third bullet, fourth bullet down, renewal projects originally awarded under DV bonus must continue to serve survivors, which is certainly what we want to see happening. Projects applying under the DV bonus must enter data into an HMIS comparable database. That's in the wrong spot. So we'll go back to that in just a second, sorry. So HUD will score DV projects using a 100-point scale. This is similar to, but different, how we went through the tier 2 scoring of projects. This is really important because if you're thinking about applying for DV bonus, here's what I need you to know. The way that we are scored, as you can see here for rapid rehousing, for example, it is similar to the tier 2 scoring in that half of the points come from how well we do in the CoC application. But the rest of it has to do with the way that we describe the need for additional DV dedicated resources, which both in the East and West, that will not be a problem to be able to describe and articulate, because as you likely know, a substantial percentage of the folks on the by name list are also identified as fleeing domestic violence. So we won't have any problems in terms of describing the need. But the real key for us is that 25, that last bullet point, 25 out of 100 points for the quality of project applicant. This, I can't overemphasize how important this is. This is where we describe in great detail the services that the system will provide to survivors, that the work, the services will be survivor driven, trauma informed, harm reduction, all of the words of all of the things that we're looking for. Is where we really have to show this is what is going to sort of make or break the Eastern and Western PA CoC in terms of whether or not the things that we can control and whether or not we are able to successfully be awarded that substantial pot of money that we're eligible for. And so we're going to be looking for applicants specifically who are responsive to the questions that will be in the DV application, the preliminary application. So what is their experience in terms of providing survivor-driven services? What is their experience in regards to providing housing for them? What are the outcomes that they have achieved, and to talk in detail in different ways that their services are trauma-informed and victim-centered. So just be aware if you're thinking about applying for that's really where we're going to be looking at the quality of the project application, because it's a very different scoring. This actually goes into the CoC application and how we respond to it. So it's very different than any other project type. I just want folks to be aware. So look for that forthcoming. I'm not going to go into detail, but here's the scoring for the DV bonus coordinated entry. And then I'll go back to this, that was in the wrong spot, so we don't lose it. But there are, I'll put this in the right place before we send out the PowerPoint. But there are guides, there's the hyperlink there. There will be, HUD has not yet released it, at least not as of yesterday, the guides that they have for transition grants, expansion grants, and the DV bonus for the detailed instructions and the eSNAPS sort of navigation guides. Hopefully by the time new projects are selected, that information will be available. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Helen and just apologize because we are running behind, and so I'm sorry, Helen, for cutting you short a little bit here. If you want to prompt me when you're ready to change slides, though, I can do that. Or do you prefer to switch to you controlling it?
No, it's fine. We could keep it as is. It'll save time that way. All right, so I'm going to do a bit of slide reading, and I apologize. It's just there's a lot of details here, and we wanted to make sure you all had it, not in the form of the NOFO, which could be a bit overwhelming, but you have it in this more user-friendly version. And just to make sure everything is covered, we are obviously going to verbally go through everything. So the first type of grant that we're going to talk about that you may choose to do is a transition grant. And this is a grant to fund a new, so this is a new project to transition an eligible renewal project being eliminated through reallocation from one program component to another over a 1-year period. Transition grants cannot also be expansions. And so what you're going to be able to do is reallocate the existing eligible renewal component to an eligible new project component, which aligns with all the new types of projects that Lee talked about before. So PSH, Rapid, Joint THRR, HMIS, and SOCE. To be eligible for a transition grant, you have to have the same recipient for all of the renewal ones that you're going to be eliminating. Go ahead. Okay. When you are transitioning, you have 1 year to go from your old component type into your new component type. You are basically completely eliminating one or more projects to be able to create this one single new transition grant. No more than 50, this is something to keep in mind as you're going through, budgeting and things like that. No more than 50% of each transition grant may be used for the program component originally funded. So if you had PSH, you are transitioning it to a Rapid because there's more of a need for that in your area. You can't spend more than 50% on PSH, which is what it originally was. The whole idea is like out with the old, in with the new. So you have to kind of that 50% threshold in mind. Then anything, once you're renewed, once it's approved as this new type, then you're eligible for renewal under that new project type. And you must have the consent of, yep, so if you're gonna go in for this, you're just gonna have to ask the CoC for permit before you do it, that you just like, oh, these guys are transitioning, like when did that happen? There should just be a conversation about that with the CoC before that happens. Okay, next one. Yep. So if you're going to be applying for this, there's a couple of steps that you're going to have to do in eSNAP that other non-transition grants aren't going to have to do. And that would be to provide the grant numbers of the project being eliminated to create the new project and attach the copy of the most recently awarded project application. You're going to be focusing on screen 3A and question 7 and then subsequently 7B. That's where you're going to be indicating the details related to your transition grant. So how the transition is going to be happening, what are the expiring grants.
Helen, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think you're frozen. Or I'm frozen. Well, I just saw Kathy move, so that's good.
No, she's frozen.
Okay, I'm gonna start talking then, and hopefully Helen will be able to join us in a minute. Here's my overall message about the transition grants. These were more common when we had transitional housing projects. Oh, Helen, I'm not sure if you know, but you've frozen twice, so uh-oh. I think she just disappeared. Okay, I'm gonna keep talking. These were more common when we had transitional housing projects that were looking to transition to either Rapid or permanent supportive housing, sort of to avoid elimination of that grant and to provide a different intervention in their communities. The bottom line is, if you are thinking about doing this still at this point, just let us know so we can sort of brainstorm with you, strategize with you to make sure this makes sense, and then you can proceed to apply if necessary. Sorry, Helen, I see you're not frozen. You disappeared and you were frozen a few times, so I just started taking over, sorry. What I can do is, there are certain slides that I'm just gonna, if you're not frozen, ask you if you can really talk in more detail about, but I'll just keep on trucking, sorry for that. Again, transition grants, if you're gonna apply for these and you're funded, the instructions here of things you need to look out for. but really just make sure that you let us know, as Helen just said. Expansion grants, these are a lot more common in the CoC because it gives folks an opportunity to take an existing project and add units or add services that you did not realize that you needed when you originally applied for the grant, but now that you're operating it, you do, or you realize that we only applied for a half of a case manager, but we really need a full-time case manager. Or maybe you have a 0.8 full-time employee as part of that, and you realize if we had X number of additional units, we could increase that person to full-time. And that would just make more sense to operate the project in that way. It gives folks an opportunity to either apply for portions of a project to sort of make it whole, or to even just double the size of the project and complete. But the benefit of an expansion is that you don't have two separate project applications. Typically, the expansion grants come online more quickly, meaning when you renew the FY21, when the date, like let's say October 1st is the date of your that you renew your grant every year. It would mean that October 1st of 2022, if this was funded, you would not only be funded for your existing renewal project, but also the expansion portion of that project as well. It would sort of like seamlessly be added into your project. So there's a lot of benefits of expansion if it's something you're thinking about. There are rules around expansion. You can't expand, for example, a rapid with PSH. You can't expand a RRH to have more rapid only as a separate rapid standalone. There's certain rules. If you have questions about it because you want to do that, you can certainly reach out to us to ask. The application has information as well. It's certainly, I think, a good option for folks who are coming in for a new project. If it fits, it will be a way to get the money on the street more quickly, which is a good thing, and we want to certainly encourage that. It also means that you won't have two APRs and two data sets and two budgets to manage, etc. Here are some very specific instructions to eSNAP. So this implies that you came in for an expansion, you were selected by the funding committee, and you were approved. If that all happens, then there are some there's some information here about how to go through that on eSNAPs. Very quickly, the appeal process. This is specific for new project applications. We've already gone through the appeal process for renewal scoring, and there is no appeal process for ranking. You're ranked according to your rank location. There's a number of factors, including the score that you received as a renewal project that goes into that. It certainly doesn't mean that there's not adjustments that can be made related to the final ranking. There are times where, specifically in tier 2, projects may be moved around a little bit, and that happens for a number of reasons. It happens because we may realize that a project is scored very low in a community that if they lost that resource, they would have no resource. And in an effort to make sure that that community is not left without resources, that project gets moved up a little bit to hopefully shore up the fact that it receives funding. There are other reasons why, but for the most part, if it's a descending rank order based on your renewal score. With projects that were not able to be scored, ranked in tier 1, as well as CoC sort of infrastructure projects, which I would consider to be like HMIS and coordinated entry. Those also always sort of go into tier 1 because the CoC can't operate without those projects. But for new projects specifically, there you will receive in the app your funding, the letter from the funding committee indicating whether your project was approved or denied. It will have information about the timeline and the instructions for appealing, the kind of information you should consider if you are appealing, what would be compelling in terms of the funding committee or whoever is the entity to review the appeal. The information around the appeal process and all of the policies related to funding are in the CoC's funding. It's this document right here, CoC funding process and policies document, which is on the CoC website. There's a separate one for the East and a separate one for the West that outlines the appeal process. But just know that if you are not selected for a new project, you can certainly opt to appeal that decision. Renewal projects, I know this is what a lot of you have been waiting for. Starting on page 5, the detailed instructions includes a list of the screens that you should review or update. So if this is your first time, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But if it's not your first time, I will start by just saying that there is, you have the opportunity to review the information that is in the application when it is sort of pre-filled, and make updates as needed. There are certain screens that require annual updates, and those are listed out there at the bottom of the screen, from recipient performance screen to all of Part 8. So you have the ability to sort of go in, check off, fill in, update, etc. Other than that, the screens that sort of pre-fill are locked in place. You can opt to go to the submission summary, click a button to make edits to those other screens if needed. If you don't need to update them, I would encourage you to leave them alone, because the projects that have already been funded, that are already pre-filled, have already passed HUD threshold in previous years. And so if you don't have a reason to make an update, don't make an update. The goal here is to make sure that your project is funded by HUD, that there are no findings that sort of delay their ability to contract with you, etc. So don't make updates unless you need to. If you need to, obviously do so. Reasons that may require updates would be, for example, if you were expanding the grant, if you were approved for an expansion grant, you might need to go in and click that somewhere. If you were reduced through a reallocation, you would need to go in and make adjustments to your application budget and other screens as well. That all that information will be provided if that applies to you. There's a handful of projects, specifically in the Eastern PA CoC that you're going to get more instructions for us about this, but if you're on and this is one of your projects, I just want you to be on the lookout for it. There are, because we did not have a 2020 CoC competition, you all did not go into eSnaps and update your budgets and your other things. However, your contracts for FY20 were updated because HUD updates based on fair market rent changes. Your fair market rent increase, your projects increased or decreased, and other projects that are still not tied to fair market rent, but they're tied to actual rent, they also get updates and modifications to the rent amounts requested. The difference is that when you pre-fill, you have your 2021 renewal application sort of pre-fill from 2019, it's not going to show the correct rent amounts that you were actually awarded in 2020. So for the projects that are listed on this screen, just know that you are going to have to manually enter some rent amounts. We have that information based on bedroom size, which boxes will need to be updated. But please know that if you go ahead and go into eSnaps, which you can do at any point now that we've had this webinar and start, but you will need to make sure that you get that information from us, and we will be sending it out with the other materials today. If that didn't apply to you, don't worry. And if it did apply to you and you have no idea what I said, don't worry, we will have more details and you can always follow up. I already mentioned submitting without changes, that you're going to want to do that anywhere that you can. Please make sure that you just take a more in-depth look at these slides. If you want to make changes to your application, you will need to navigate to the Submit Without Changes screen. I said it was called the Submission Summary screen. Apparently it is not, so it's called the Submit Without Changes screen. Once there, you'll be able to indicate whether you want to make changes by answering question 2. If you indicate that you want to make changes in question 2, you'll be able to select the screens that you would like to edit. So after you edit those screens, make sure that you hit complete, etc. There's also a page where you will have to indicate to HUD, I made a change to 3B and what that change was. Again, these renewal projects have already passed HUD threshold and review. So if you're making a change to it, they want to go through these as quickly as possible to figure out what is different. And so you just need to put a quick brief note indicating whatever changes you needed to make. Match. On the 7A attachment screen, you will need to include third-party in-kind match commitment on the sources of match screen. It says that you have to have a MOU or MOA to be attached. Match letters not referenced in the instructions, but based on previous years, we suggest that you ensure they are updated in your files and that the dates and amounts on the match letters are updated. This will be needed for contracting. So hopefully everybody knows that when you are entering into your contract, that's when you have to provide the match letters, but HUD expects that at the time of application that you have the match on hand. These are the slides that Helen, forgive me for reading, these are the slides that I was gonna have Helen present. So I just wanna turn to Helen for a minute to say, is there anything that I've sort of skimmed over that you wanna say in more detail?
No, except that obviously it says renewal projects up here, but just in case someone didn't pick up on this, especially if they're going to be a new project applicant, you do need to, with the new project applications, you do need to submit the match letter if it's in kind. So that's a difference between the two. This note on not having to attach it really just applies to the renewal projects.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so by October 1, we are asking folks to have your renewal applications completed in eSnaps. If you can do it before October 1, especially if you don't need to make changes, it will be a snip snap. It will take no time at all. And we highly encourage you to submit before then. What happens if you don't is that we get 150 applications on the same day, which is very challenging and certainly slows down the timeline of how quickly we can respond to you. If we get a trickle in from, next Monday through October 1st, we will be able to get back to everybody more quickly. So please just make sure you schedule time to do that. Especially, like I said, if you have no changes, it should not be a time-consuming process. If you are new to this process, you may have no idea about this, but we will be providing instructions. There is a Dropbox link. There's a spreadsheet we'll be sending. Every single project will have its own unique Dropbox link. You send an email to the link that we have, or there's a button. Clearly, Lee Howard is not the person who set this up. So forgive me for not being more clear. I meant to have Fern on here to talk through this from our office, but she has written detailed instructions for folks to know whether you're uploading it or emailing it or whichever it's supposed to be that I should already know and I don't. So you will have a link. You will use that to submit your renewal project. Just to be clear, you will not submit it in eSnaps. You're going into eSnaps, you're doing it, you're making sure all of the projects, all of the boxes on the submission summary are completed, but you're not hitting submit. The reason, if you don't know, is that the eSnaps system is clunky. And there are times where projects get caught in space and we can't access them and you can't access them. And now we have to send an email to the eSnaps at HUD email and God knows when they're going to get back to us. So we want to avoid all of that and just say, export the PDF, upload it to the Dropbox. We will review your PDF, get our comments back to you. At that point, you'll have 5 days to make the corrections, and then you will hit submit in eSnaps, and everything will be fine and good and completed for you. Here's instructions just on the way you're going to name your file for the Dropbox submission. But like I said, you'll just export a PDF. So by October 15th, you will receive a project review form with required corrections. Just to be clear, there are only a handful of things that we are looking at in your application. We are looking to make sure, just like we went through what was required for HUD threshold, for new projects, there are HUD threshold for renewal projects. We will be looking at that to make sure everything is fine and good. We will also be looking to make sure that you said yes to all the housing first questions, or no where it requires a no, but you answered them all appropriately. And we will be looking at a handful of other specific boxes to make sure that there's information that we have to collect from your application that then feeds into the CoC application. If it's something other than that, we probably will not see it. So if you are making a change to your application and you have a question related to it, please send an email to our office using the Eastern CoC or Western CoC at PennsylvaniaCoC.org email addresses. Do not email me directly, please, or Helen, but send it to the CoC email address. So you'll receive our comments by October 15th. Like I said, that's sort of the longest end, assuming if we got all 150 of your applications on October 1st. If we get a trickle, then you will get it far sooner than that October 15th date. And then you'll have 5 days, or at the most by October 22nd, to submit those applications. There are instruction guides. Here are the links. The guides on eSnaps are quite good. I can assure you that literally almost any question you have could be answered if you reviewed the document yourself. We highly encourage you to do that. If you still have a question, you can certainly reach out to us, but please make sure to read that first, because as I mentioned just a moment ago, there's about 150 project applications. And if all of you have questions, that's a whole lot for us to be responding to at a time we're also working on the new projects and the CoC application. That being said, we're here to support you as you need it, but please rely on these HUD handbooks as possible. If you are a first-time renewal, you will need to set up your application. There are also instructions within the eSnaps navigation guide for how to do that. It does mean that your very first time, you're going to have a lot more text. You don't have that benefit of it flying from space from 2019 to 2021 and inputting. You're going to have to enter it. So I would recommend, if you don't have a copy of your 2019 new project application, that's the only folks it would apply to, that you have it handy so that you can do a lot of copying and pasting of your narratives and things like that. It'll make that process of completing the renewal application in eSnaps far more efficient and quick for you. Consolidation, I mentioned previously this was 4, now it can go up to 10. There are some specific rules. Consolidation is when you take 2 or more existing renewal projects and you combine them into one budget. There are benefits to it. You only have one ELOCS account that you're drawing from, one data, one organization in HMIS that you're entering your data into, one APR to submit, et cetera, et cetera. You can now consolidate up to 10 projects at one time. You can, if you have some PSH projects and some rapid projects, you can consolidate those separately into one project, one PSH and then one rapid project. If you are worried about, will we lose money? There is a process by which HUD prorates everything so that you don't have a reduction in overall funding. That's something that folks, if they have different operating dates for grants, they always worry about. I have not had anybody come back to me to say HUD didn't configure this right and now we have a gap in funding. There is a process for that, and the intention is that you will be whole to be able to operate the project as one full project without having any sort of reduction in funding or a period of time where you don't have funding for a portion of your project. Things to know is they must have the same recipient. So if you're a subrecipient on one and a recipient on another, you cannot combine. You have to be the project applicant on both, and it has to be for the same components. You can't combine Rapid and PSH into one project. That those would be separate and remain separate. HUD will not permit projects with the following characteristics to consolidate. So just keep in mind, if you are considering consolidation, these are things that HUD may sort of deny your consolidation request related to these issues. I already mentioned it's not allowed to combine in certain ways. You can't combine, for example, if you're transitioning your grant from Rapid to PSH, you can't then combine it that year with another PSH project. So just know that if you're already doing some fancy footwork with your project, don't try to extend that into consolidation. You'll need to wait a year. Project applications for the grants that are proposed to be consolidated will be ranked with a unique rank number for each project. And if all those projects are selected, HUD will award the surviving grant based on its ranked position to include the amount of funding of all consolidated grants. So here's what this means. If you're trying to consolidate 3 grants and 2 are in tier 1 and 1 is in tier 2, for example, they will not be consolidated unless all 3 projects are funded. So just be aware of that. Additional considerations, the BLIs, the budget line items for the consolidated projects submitted exactly match the sum of the BLIs for each individual project. So that makes sense. If you have $100,000 of rental assistance and 3 separate projects that you're consolidating, your rental assistance is going to be $300,000. The expiring grant numbers and operating start and end dates for projects are provided. And then this is for projects that have operating end dates in calendar year 2022. That last bullet you don't need to worry about because we're going to make sure that if you're doing it correctly. That's our job. Consolidation, here are some specific resources to do that. If you've done consolidation in the past and you want to do it again, just so you know, there is not a separate consolidated application any longer. So that's good to know in case you're wondering where that is. Okay, eSNAP's submission tips. I know that we are over time. We've got like 3 or 4 slides left. Helen, I don't know if you want to try one more time to walk us through the eSNAP's submissions tips or not. If you get frozen, I can certainly do that.
Okay, yeah, I could try. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So the big takeaway here is on the submission summary page, that's going to be at the very, very end of the application. It's going to have all of the different screens that you had needed to complete. And it's either like a check mark, I forget what indicates that you're good to go, but you will notice a red X if any of those screens have anything that isn't as it should be. Doesn't necessarily mean that the content is correct. That's what we're checking for, but something, the way you answered something in eSNAPs or logic doesn't follow, something along those lines, you'll have a red X. If you have any of those, please go back into that screen that has that red X and try and figure out what might be missed. It might be a blank. It could be a number of different things. But by the time any application comes to DMA for review, there should be no red X's. So that's kind of like your first line of defense. See if there's any red X's at all on that summary page. Go on to the next slide. Okay, this is what Lee talked about before with not having an AAQ anymore. The AAQ, just to be clear, does exist. It does not exist, however, for anything NOFO or eSNAPs related. And these would be the 2 emails that you would use depending on what seemed to be most appropriate. And I think Lee did a pretty good job already of explaining. Unfortunately, we don't have a turnaround time. There is a group that I'm a part of with lots of other CoC folks from all around the country, and we've all been kind of chiming in. One person, everyone wants to know what's the turnaround time. One person got 1 question answered in about a week. As I mentioned, I'm going on 3 weeks. I just forwarded all of my questions back to HUD again. Hopefully that helps. If we find out any tips or turnaround times, anything to make that go a little bit more quickly, then we will certainly let you know. That said, I think, Lee, did we share the tip sheet yet, or are we going to? We
Yes.
can, right?
We'll be sending it out.
Okay, so on that, there's a tip
with the
sheet.
PowerPoint and everything else.
Okay, perfect. So on that tip sheet, we actually walk you through when you're trying to explain something to HUD, it's really important that you share certain pieces of information. So if you have a screenshot that goes along with to explain what you're trying to get through to them. If there's a specific screen, usually it has to do with a question on a specific screen. All of those details are really, really important and will help minimize the back and forth that you will have with HUD. We don't suggest going to us to ask HUD, because so many times HUD just wants to talk to the person with the issue. They want to troubleshoot it with them. They want to have that back and forth. If you're not sure how to word something, then that's something different. We can try and help you get it as clearly as possible across the HUD. Otherwise, we encourage you to really go in and just ask them directly. And something Lee mentioned, the detailed instructions and navigational guides. Make sure you're looking at the one for either renewals or new projects, because they're different, but they are very, 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 very good. They are actually better than they were in 2019. There are screenshots and it says like, if A, then do this. And that is where we go to first. So if you ask us a question, say, I don't know how to answer this, or this looks like this, the very first thing that Christy or I or Jessica that we'll do is open up those guides. And I want to say, like, I'm not exaggerating, like 95% of the time, the answer is right there. And we will then say, please turn to page 11 and you will find your answer there. So please check that out. It'll save you time instead of having to wait for us to take a look and point you in the right direction. And this is just, if you have questions, ask them as soon as you have them, because starting 2 days, well, for you guys, everything should already be in 2 days prior. That's more for us. They're not really going to be looking at the emails after within 2 days of the NOFO being due. Next slide. Okay, this I won't spend time because we're running out of time, but there are a slew of resources available to help you make sure that your applicant profile is set up correctly. It's also one of the things that folks either get the most confused about, or that there tends to be the most mistakes on when we're reviewing. So just, I would go through these resources and just double check yourself. And then these are all of the, not all of the resources, consolidation, transition, and I believe expansion. They're gonna have links just for them. There's gonna be some guides that are gonna be available, but HUD hasn't published those yet. That said, that when they are available, they will be on these pages. When you go on the HUD Exchange, it's actually laid out really well. It's super user friendly, and you'll see eSNAPS guides. There's like a 101 and a 201 this year, and then you can actually look by project type. So if you're a renewal applicant, you click on it, all of the different things you need to know are right there. And so other things that you can click on are consolidation projects, expansion projects, transition projects, and that will walk you through in greater detail how to navigate that within eSNAPS, more so than looking at the nav guides for new or renewal projects, but they're not available yet. So you'll just have to keep on checking back. I know I check every day just to see when they pop up. Next slide, I think that might be it. Yep. Isn't this fun? I love it. I don't know, few people enjoy the NOFO season as much as I do, and as much as Lee does, but truly, like, this is like, I love this work, and I'm really excited to like getting to review all your applications and, you know, really making sure they get to be where they need to be for HUD to fund them.
We just spend most of our days when we're not talking to you dancing just like Snoopy. So that's how much fun we're having with it. So absolutely. So I know we're a few minutes over. I apologize. But if there are any questions that folks did not ask in the chat already, but you want to sort of talk through now, you can certainly unmute yourself or feel free to type something else in. You can also follow up in an email. Hopefully you have the email information, but if not, I'm gonna enter it into the chat right now. Apparently I can't talk and type the word Pennsylvania at one time, which is news to me, but apparently it's true. So those are the Eastern and Western CoC email addresses for you to submit questions to, and we certainly welcome and encourage you to do that as they come up. Anything burning today that you want to talk through, though? Okay, well, we really appreciate everybody's time. Again, apologies for going It looks like it's 11:39, so we went 9 minutes over. A lot of information to talk through today, so thanks for hanging in there with us. Please just know that it should be by this afternoon. If for some reason the emails don't go through, they will be there, I would assume overnight and in the morning. But hopefully by late today, you'll receive the PowerPoint from us, the Dropbox links, the slides, as well as the tip sheet that Helen just mentioned. And we'll also make sure that we provide, if it's not today, very soon, just the NOFO page on the CoC website, one for the East and one for the West, so that you can know that that's sort of the central place that we will have the RFP, for example, posted once it's released. We will also be sending that out via email. Like I said, I do expect that the new project RFP will be out no later than Monday. So feel free to submit questions and follow up with us following the release of the new project RFP if you have any questions. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, and the DMA team for this presentation.
Thanks, Brendan.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Brendan. Bye.
You too.